So we're going to talk now about stages of memory. So remember we did types of memory, processes of memory, and now we're talking about stages of memory. And stages of memory essentially are stages of storage. It's what stages information has to go through in order for storage to be complete. And the three stages we're going to talk about are sensory, short-term, and long-term memory. Sensory memory should sound really familiar because essentially what we're talking about here is selective attention. And it's not just essentially, it is. We're talking about selective attention. And so sensory memory is a screening mechanism. Of all the information that comes in, we decide what we're going to pay attention to, right? So we're going to screen one thing in. We're going to screen everything else out. And the thing that gets screened in now is a candidate for getting stored as memory. Everything that's screened out is not a candidate for being stored as memory. And we can hold things here for up to several seconds. Once we decide it's a candidate for memory, we move it on to short-term memory. And short-term memory is our working memory. It essentially is the whiteboard that you have in front of you, and you can put some stuff on the whiteboard, but it's not going to be on the whiteboard permanently, right? New stuff is going to come in and replace it. And so it is what we're paying attention to. As long as we keep paying attention to things, it stays in our short-term memory. So if you're having a conversation with somebody, you're holding all of what have we been talking about in the last few minutes in your short-term memory. But if you get distracted, you might come back and say, what were we talking about, right? You don't remember and have to be prompted at that point. And so things stay here. If we stop paying attention to them, then information stays here for about 10 to 30 seconds. If we continue paying attention, we can keep it here forever in the same way that if I don't erase the whiteboard, I can keep things there forever. But short-term memory has limits, that it's only meant to be temporary storage. And so we said 10 to 30 seconds. Space limits, though, is what is often referred to as 7 plus or minus 2. I don't know why we don't just say 5 to 9, because that's what it means. But it's 7 plus or minus 2 bits of information. And a bit of information is anything you see as one piece. Which means that you can, in some ways, extend the capacity of short-term memory by seeing things at a bigger, kind of chunking information together, so you can get more information into a single piece of information. So, for example, phone numbers are a good example of this. So the phone number on the slide is my phone number at my office at Naugatuck. But you'll notice, like 203, most of you aren't going to treat that as 3 bits of information. 203 is going to be treated for most of you as 1 bit of information. In fact, you're going to probably say 203 as if you mean 1 bit of information. And then I happen to know that at the college, all of our phone numbers are either 575 or 596, which means I treat 575 as a single bit of information also. Right, so we chunk it so that's not actually 10 digits. At most, it's 8, which fits nicely into our 5 to 9 bits of information. Once we exceed our 5 to 9 bits of information, we see something called a serial position effect, which is what you see here. Let me just see if I can move this so you can see it better. The serial position effect says the things that come in first. So if you, for example, had a string of numbers, if I recited a string of numbers that was 9 digits long to you, you would remember the first digits I said best. You would remember the last set of digits well, and then these digits, like numbers 4, 5, and 6 in the middle, would be remembered least well. And the reason for that, if you think about it, if I was to start saying strings of numbers to you, you would, after I said the first 3 or 4, probably be trying to repeat those to yourself as you listen to the next set of numbers. And because you're repeating them, you're actually giving less attention to the middle set of numbers. And the recent numbers just always get preference. Short-term memory is a first in, first out kind of a thing. And so the most recent ones are just always going to be given preference. Long-term memory, right? So we go from sensory memory to short-term, right? And we're still a candidate for being stored. Not everything's going to get stored. But once we make it to long-term memory, that candidate has succeeded and it's become something that has been successfully stored. Quality of the storage is going to go back to that whole storage conversation we had, but it has some storage has occurred. Long-term memory is essentially permanent. We obviously can forget things, but it is essentially permanent. There's no time limits, there's no space limits. And storage is really that moment when we move from short-term to long-term memory, to that permanent memory storage. Um, we mentioned before in storage that long-term memory is linked to emotion, or that emotion enhances long-term memory. There is that video that I asked you to watch, and it talks about the amygdala and adrenaline, so make sure you watch that. There is a specific kind of light bulb memory called a light bulb memory or a flash bulb memory, where it's for things that are unexpected and emotional. And we create really, really crisp memories of those because of the adrenaline involved. For some of you, your first memory is going to have been something like that, right? So something that often first memories are of getting hurt, or being upset about something. And these don't have to be bad things. These also can be cultural things. So for those of us that were alive when 9/11 occurred, most of us have flashbulb memories. I can tell you exactly where I was standing on the 6th floor of Kinney when I found out that a plane had hit one of the towers. I can tell you who told me, what the conversation was like, as if it's happening to me again, and it's because of the surprise and the emotion that was present at the time. I mentioned earlier in one of the earlier videos the idea of explicit and implicit memory, and I just want to kind of remind you of these again because you're going to watch a video in a little while that's going to rely on your knowledge about that. Explicit memory relies on the use of the hippocampus, which is not something we've said yet, and it is that memory that when we make long-term memory that's deliberate and that we're aware that we're making it. And so I had said all episodic and some semantic memory falls into that category. But then we have implicit memory, which is more automatic long-term memory, that we're not consciously or effortfully making the memory, and we're not really aware of having to retrieve it in any way. And it does not use the hippocampus, it uses the cerebellum. So all this talk about the hippocampus so far has been about that explicit memory. But it uses the cerebellum. That's why it's more automatic or feels outside of consciousness to us. And that's procedural memory and some semantic memory. When sometimes when we forget things in long-term memory, it's because of interference, and that's about similarity, right? So if you know somebody else who looks a lot like me, you may call me by their name accidentally, and it's just about your, in that case, probably your hippocampus getting a little confused, and not being certain which information it is that it's supposed to be calling up for you. I do want to talk some about amnesia, and you have a video you're going to watch that I'll talk about in just a moment. But amnesia is different than forgetting because it is not expected. It's a failure of retrieval or a failure of storage that falls outside of what we normally experience. And typically we see amnesia as a disorder. There is a kind of amnesia called dissociative amnesia, which is about essentially it is about pushing things into the unconscious, essentially deliberately screening out information as a way of protecting yourself. Typically, this is very temporary. It can be long term, but typically this is very temporary, minutes long, maybe hours long, but rarely longer than that. And we could talk about amnesia that results from physical trauma. So, right, so this is amnesia that's resulting from an injury to the brain. And we tend to think about this in two different ways, retrograde or anterograde, which I know kind of odd words. But think about retrograde, think about that word retro in the middle of it, right? You know retro means old-fashioned or from the past. And so retrograde amnesia is the loss of the ability to retrieve information from the past and retrieve information that was previously stored. Anterograde amnesia is the opposite. It is the loss of the ability to store new information. So retrograde is I used to know it and now something's happened to my brain and I no longer know it. Anterograde is that I have an injury to my brain and now that injury makes it so that I can't store new memory. I might be able to retrieve old memories if I just have an anterograde. And I really need to do that. So what I want you guys to do is to watch the Clive Waring video. And Clive Waring is a man who had encephalitis, which is a swelling of the brain. They'll call it encephalitis because that's the way it's pronounced in Britain. and he is British. And what they talk about in there is that he has a complete retrograde and a complete anterograde amnesia, so he can't retrieve old things and can't store new things, only for explicit memory. And what I want you to pay attention to in that video is that the encephalitis destroyed his hippocampus, and so he has no explicit memory at all. It left his cerebellum intact. And so he has implicit memory. So what I want you to do while you're watching that video is maybe even have a pen in your hand and make a list of all of the examples of memory that is disrupted and therefore is explicit memory, and all of the memory that is intact and therefore is implicit memory. And we'll certainly use part of a live discussion to go over that. So do make sure you watch that. Okay? Have a great day, guys.